Deep beneath the ice of a remote region in northern Iraq, archaeologists once pulled something out of the frozen ground that stopped them cold. It was not a weapon. It was not a burial. It was a clay tablet, perfectly preserved, covered in symbols so mathematically precise that when modern scholars finally decoded it, the room went silent. Because what they were looking at was not supposed to exist. Not from that era, not from that civilization, not from a world that, by all accounts, should have still been figuring out how to farm. What they held in their hands was proof that Babylon was doing something no one had prepared us to accept, and that tablet was only the beginning. Sign 1. They solved geometry 1000 for the Greeks. A tablet pulled from the ancient ruins of Babylon, now known in academic circles as Plimpton 322, sat in the collections of Columbia University for decades before anyone truly understood what it was. Most assumed it was a simple accounting record, a ledger of trade goods or land measurements. But in 2017, a team of mathematicians from the University of New South Wales in Australia reanalyzed the tablet and published findings that shook the academic world to its foundation. Plimpton 322, dated to approximately 1800 BCE, contains a sophisticated trigonometric table. Not a rough approximation, not a primitive attempt. A precise, systematic table of right triangle ratios organized in a way that is arguably more accurate and more practical than the Greek trigonometry we were taught in school. The Babylonians were not using angles. They were using ratios of sides, an approach that is, in many respects, computationally superior, especially when working with whole numbers and avoiding the rounding errors that plague angle-based systems. Let that sink in for a moment. The civilization we associate with ancient ziggurats and mythological kings was doing applied mathematics so refined that modern engineers working in computer graphics and surveying are only now beginning to appreciate its elegance. The Pythagorean theorem, named after a Greek philosopher who lived more than 1,000 years after this tablet was inscribed, was already embedded in Babylonian mathematical practice. They did not call it by his name. They did not need to. They had already been using it for generations. And here is what makes this truly astonishing. This was not the work of a single isolated genius. The consistency and complexity of the tablet suggests an entire educational infrastructure, a system of scribal schools, trained mathematicians, and standardized curricula. The Babylonians were not stumbling onto math. They were teaching it. Sign 2. They predicted eclipses with algorithmic precision. If the mathematics did not convince you, consider this. Babylon had a functioning predictive astronomy system so accurate that modern scientists have used their records to recalibrate our own measurements of Earth's rotational slowdown over the past 2.5 millennia. The Babylonians kept what researchers call the astronomical diaries, meticulous night-by-night records of celestial events spanning centuries. These were not casual observations. They were systematic data collection projects, and they were used to build mathematical models that could predict the positions of the Moon, the Sun, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, and more, months and sometimes years in advance. Their system for predicting lunar eclipses, known as the Saros cycle, identifies a repeating pattern of approximately 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours after which eclipses recur in a predictable sequence. The Babylonians discovered this cycle, encoded it into their records, and used it operationally. Priests and astronomers could look at a calendar and tell a king, with confidence, exactly when the moon would darken. In an era when eclipses terrified populations and were seen as omens of divine wrath, this was not just scientific achievement. It was political power of the highest order. But the depth does not stop there. A cuneiform tablet now housed in the British Museum reveals something even more extraordinary. The Babylonians developed a method for calculating the speed of Jupiter across the sky using a technique that mathematicians call numerical integration, the same foundational concept that sits at the heart of calculus. This was described in a 2016 paper in the journal Science, and it sent shockwaves through the history of mathematics. The technique was previously believed to have been invented in medieval Europe, roughly 1,400 years after Babylon had already mastered it. If you are still watching this, what comes next is perhaps the most overlooked sign of all, and it involves something hiding in plain sight inside their language itself. Sign 3. Their writing system was an early information technology. When most people think of cuneiform, they picture crude scratches pressed into wet clay by ancient scribes. But that mental image severely underestimates what the Babylonians had actually built. Cuneiform was not just writing. It was a scalable information storage and retrieval system, the first true data architecture in human history. At its peak, Cuneiform was used across an enormous geographic area stretching from modern-day Turkey to Egypt, from Iran to the eastern Mediterranean. It was the lingua franca of international diplomacy, commerce, law, medicine, and science across multiple cultures and languages simultaneously. The script was adapted to write Sumerian, Akkadian, Elamite, Hittite, Hurrian, and others, functioning as a kind of ancient Unicode, flexible enough to encode radically different languages within the same system. More remarkable still is the sheer volume of written records the Babylonians produced. Hundreds of thousands of tablets have been recovered, and archaeologists estimate that the majority of ancient Babylonian writing remains unexcavated. The city maintained libraries, the most famous being the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal in nearby Nineveh, which held tens of thousands of tablets, systematically catalogued by subject, author, and series. They had organized knowledge retrieval systems. They had reference librarians, in effect. They had what we would today recognize as institutional knowledge management. Legal contracts, property deeds, medical diagnoses, astronomical reports, letters between merchants, complaints to supervisors, school exercises, love poetry. The Babylonians wrote everything down and stored it with intention. This was not a culture documenting itself by accident. It was a civilization that understood the strategic value of recorded information and built systems to preserve and access it across generations. Sign 4. Their medicine was evidence-based, not just ritual. Here is where the story takes a turn that most history courses never mention. For decades, scholars assumed Babylonian medicine was entirely rooted in magic and superstition, diagnosis by divination, treatment by incantation, healing through the appeasement of demons, and while those elements certainly existed in their culture, the medical texts reveal something far more complex underneath. The Babylonians produced detailed medical compendia, systematic collections of symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments. The Diagnostic Handbook, a series of cuneiform tablets from around 1050 BCE, contains clinical observations organized in a logical, sequential format. A physician would observe a patient, note the symptoms, trace a differential diagnosis, identify a likely cause, and prescribe treatment. The structure is recognizably empirical. It is built around observation and pattern recognition, not just prayer. More striking is the Babylonian understanding of internal anatomy. They identified and named specific body parts, tracked the progression of diseases over time, and recognized that certain conditions were contagious. They distinguished between symptoms that suggested the patient would survive and those that indicated death was near, a form of clinical prognosis that has direct parallels to modern triage. Their pharmacological knowledge was also far from primitive. Babylonian medical texts reference hundreds of plants, minerals, and animal products used as remedies, many of which have been confirmed by modern phytochemistry to have genuine biological activity. Willow bark, for instance, appears in their records as a remedy for fever and inflammation. It contains salicin, the compound from which aspirin was later derived. They did not understand the chemistry, but they had observed the effect, recorded it, and institutionalized the treatment across centuries of medical practice. And here is where it gets particularly unsettling. They also understood the physician's role in terms of professional accountability. Medical texts describe the expected competencies of a healer, the importance of following proper procedure, and the consequences for negligence. Babylon had a medical ethics framework embedded in the Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest legal codes on Earth, more than 30,700 years ago. Sign 5. They built engineering marvels that defied their era. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are traditionally listed among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and yet their existence is technically still debated, because no confirmed archaeological trace has ever been found within the city of Babylon itself. But here is the twist that recent scholarship has introduced. The Hanging Gardens may have existed, just not where everyone assumed they were built. Dr. Stephanie Daly of Oxford University spent decades arguing that the Hanging Gardens were actually constructed by the Assyrian king Sennacherib at Nineveh, not by Nebuchadnezzar at Babylon. The confusion, she argues, arose because ancient writers sometimes used the name Babylon loosely to refer to the broader Mesopotamian civilization. The archaeological evidence at Nineveh, including inscriptions describing an elaborate elevated garden irrigated by a sophisticated aqueduct system, aligns with ancient descriptions far more closely than anything found at the traditional Babylon site. But whether or not the famous gardens were where we thought, Babylon's engineering credentials are beyond dispute. The city walls of ancient Babylon were among the greatest construction projects of the ancient world. The Greek historian Herodotus described them in terms that seemed like exaggeration for centuries, until archaeology confirmed their massive scale. The Ishtar Gate, now partially reconstructed in Berlin's Pergamon Museum, demonstrates an extraordinary mastery of glazed ceramic production, architectural symmetry, and decorative programming. Their irrigation and water management systems transformed a flat, arid floodplain into one of the most agriculturally productive regions on Earth. The Babylonians engineered canals, levees, reservoirs, and regulated water flow across a network spanning hundreds of miles. Without this hydraulic infrastructure, the civilization that produced all the mathematical and astronomical achievements we have discussed could not have fed itself. The engineering was not separate from the intellectual culture. It was its physical foundation. Sign 6. They had a sophisticated legal and financial system. The Code of Hammurabi is well known, but its true significance is almost universally underappreciated. Carved into a nearly 8-foot-tall black basalt stele around 1754 BCE, the code is far more than a list of punishments. It is a comprehensive legal architecture that presupposes an entire ecosystem of financial instruments, property rights, professional licensing, and contractual obligations. Consider what this implies. For Hammurabi to write laws about interest rates, he needed there to be interest rates. For him to regulate the liability of contractors whose buildings collapse, there needed to be a developed construction industry with recognizable professional standards. For him to set rules governing the obligations of merchants and their traveling agents, there needed to be complex long-distance trade networks with established customs and expectations. The Babylonians practiced what economic historians recognize as early commercial banking. They had deposit accounts, loans at interest, letters of credit, and investment partnerships. Merchants entering a trade agreement would formalize the arrangement on a clay tablet, witnessed and sealed, then store a copy in what functioned as an archival system. Disputes could be adjudicated by reference to these records. They also developed what appears to be the world's earliest known futures contracts. Babylonian traders would agree to deliver a specific quantity of grain at a future date at a price set in the present, a hedge against price fluctuations that looks remarkably familiar to anyone who understands modern commodity markets. The financial instruments we associate with sophisticated modern economies were being executed in clay tablet form on the banks of the Euphrates 4,000 years ago. If this is the first time you are genuinely questioning what you were taught about ancient civilization, then share this video with someone who thinks history is boring, because what comes next is the sign that is perhaps the most difficult to explain. Sign 7. They may have understood infectious disease better than we assumed. Of all the hidden signs of Babylonian advancement, this one sits at the intersection of medicine, sociology, and what we might today call public health policy, and has become increasingly relevant given our own recent experiences with pandemic disease. Babylonian medical texts contain detailed descriptions of what appear to be communicable diseases, illnesses that spread from person to person, and that required specific social responses. The texts describe conditions spreading through households, through contact with the sick, and through shared environments. They identify certain individuals as capable of transmitting illness to others and recommend forms of isolation. One cuneiform text describes a condition that scholars have tentatively identified as a form of epidemic fever, possibly related to what we would call typhus or a similar vector-borne illness. The recommended response in the text is not simply spiritual purification. It includes separating the affected individual from the community, restricting contact, and monitoring those who had been exposed. This is, functionally, a quarantine protocol. The Babylonians also maintained specific religious and civic rituals that, when viewed through a modern public health lens, served epidemiological purposes. The purification rites associated with certain illnesses required physical cleansing with water and specific plant-based substances, practices that, while spiritually framed, would have reduced bacterial contamination on skin and surfaces. The integration of spiritual practice and physical hygiene was not accidental. It was the mechanism through which empirically effective behaviors were encoded into cultural practice and made sustainable across generations. They did not have germ theory, they did not understand viruses or bacteria, but they had something that is in many ways more powerful across the long timescale of civilization. They had observation, documentation, and institutionalized response. They saw patterns in how illness spread, recorded those patterns, drew behavioral conclusions, and embedded those conclusions into law, ritual, and medical practice. The result was a public health system that, by the standards of its era, was astonishingly sophisticated. The conclusion that history has been slow to accept. The civilization that rose between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was not a warm-up act for Greece and Rome. It was not a primitive ancestor fumbling toward enlightenment. It was a fully realized intellectual culture with achievements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, law, finance, and public health that in several domains were not matched or surpassed for well over 1,000 years. The reason we underestimate Babylon is partly archaeological. Much of what they built was made of mud brick, which dissolves back into the earth without extraordinary preservation conditions. It is partly linguistic. Cuneiform was a dead script for nearly 2 millennia before scholars cracked it in the 19th century, meaning that everything Babylon had recorded was inaccessible to the classical world and to medieval Europe alike. And it is partly a matter of historical narrative. We built our story of progress around a particular lineage, and Babylon did not fit comfortably into it. But the clay tablets do not lie. The mathematics speaks for itself. The astronomical records speak for themselves. And the more we excavate, the more we translate, the more we analyze what the Babylonians left behind, the clearer it becomes that we have been dramatically underestimating one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history. The frozen silence that fell over that room when scholars first understood what Plimpton 322 truly was, that silence was the sound of a paradigm cracking, and the cracks have only continued to spread. The ancient world was stranger, smarter, and far more sophisticated than the version we inherited, and Babylon, buried beneath millennia of desert sand, was at the center of it all.